U.S. President Donald Trump has signed an executive order rolling back key era climate change regulations. This could cause the U.S.'s carbon dioxide emissions to bounce back to 2005 levels. How can the U.S. so easily skirt its responsibility to help mitigate climate change? And U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson's first visit to Turkey to improve bilateral ties is called disappointing. Is the U.S.-Turkey relationship crumbling? Welcome to The Point. I'm Li Xin. Ousted South Korean President Park Geun-hye's arrest has brought the country and the world's attention to who will occupy the Blue House after the presidential election in May. Park, accused of soliciting bribes, could face more than 10 years in jail. In a sign of how far she has fallen, she will wait for her trial in jail. Moon Jae-in, a 64-year-old former lawmaker, ex-leader of the largest opposition party, is the current favorite. Moon favors closer engagement, review of the THAAD missile deployment, better ties with China, and stronger supervision of Korea's conglomerates. It is clear South Korea took the wrong path when it followed Park and her conglomerate supporters. Regardless of who wins, it will be a refreshing change to get back on track with the financial and cultural success stories that have marked China and South Korea's past relationship. Both countries need to be concerned and work together to deal with pressing regional security issues. U.S. President Donald Trump signed an energy independence executive order on Tuesday to roll back key Obama-era greenhouse gas regulations. The regulations were aimed at cutting U.S. emissions about 32% from 2005 levels by 2030, in line with the U.S.'s pledge as part of the Paris Climate Change Agreement reached at the end of 2015. Donald Trump has not yet decided whether to formally withdraw from the Paris Agreement, but by unwinding the policy needed to meet American commitments, the U.S. essentially announced that it would not comply whether it remains a signatory to the agreement or not. This decision by Trump is being cheered by Republican-run states who believe it will create thousands of jobs in the coal, oil and gas industries. However, it is making climate diplomats around the world worried that the Paris Agreement could unravel with the absence of the globe's second largest emitter at this moment. Is it acceptable for the U.S. to shrug off this global responsibility to address climate change? And what can the rest of the world do in the fight against climate change? To get more insights on the topic, I'm joined by Dr. Daniel Schrag, Director of Harvard University's Center for the Environment in Boston, and Ms. Wu Changhua, Asia Director of Third Industrial Revolution Consulting, a Washington-based think to the show. And let's start with Dr. Schrag in Washington, D.C. Now, despite the huge opposition from domestic groups as well as from experts from other countries, Donald Trump still rolled back Obama-era rules aimed at curbing climate change. Could you first explain to us what are the main points of this executive order, and how could a country's commitment to the international community be subject to political swings so easily?
Well, I should start by saying that I think that Donald Trump's position on climate change, denying the problem and ignoring decades of the best scientific analysis from our community, is really an embarrassment to the United States. There's no other way of saying it. It's an embarrassment to the United States, and it makes the United States weaker. And it's a terrible mistake. However, I think it's important to point out that this executive order actually doesn't do very much by itself. The president in our system doesn't actually have the authority to turn back regulations just with a stroke of his pen. There's a process. It's a long legal process, and so undoing the regulations that really matter will actually take some time, and there'll be fierce court resistance. So it's not at all clear that that will be successful. But I think the more fundamental point is that most of the progress that the U.S. has made on curbing its emissions has actually come from economic forces, not from political forces. Natural gas inexpensive natural gas has been such an important part of the U.S. Recipe for replacing coal, which is very dirty for conventional air pollution and has huge health impacts as well. And so that's going to continue. Nobody thinks that coal is going to come back. Indeed, there's been no new coal plants built in the U.S. for a very long time, and there's none planned for the future. So while it is an embarrassment, I would urge China and other countries to be patient and let this work out, because it's not quite as catastrophic as it sounds right now.
Now, Ms. Wu, Trump won 4 out of the 5 biggest coal-producing states during the presidential campaign. One of the reasons he signed this order to lift climate change regulations is to bring jobs back to the miners, his loyal supporters. Yet, research shows as much as 3 tons of carbon dioxide emissions is produced per ton of coal burned. If the U.S. scraps its Obama-era climate rules, known as the Clean Power Plan, its carbon dioxide emissions will bounce back to its 2005 level instead of being lower to edge toward the goal set in the Paris Agreement. So if this chart reflects the reality, how would this new executive order affect the global emissions level and the global effort to fight climate change? Ms. Wu.
I think, I think that the signal from the U.S., the executive order, definitely sends a very negative signal to the global community, meaning the U.S. is not going to probably honor its commitment to the Paris Agreement, and very negatively, actually, domestic is going to open up more fossil fuel development projects, and potentially, actually, in the energy structure, you're going to see more fossil fuels actually in the U.S. energy structure there, and potentially down some consequences to the emissions itself and also to the global emissions there as well. Very importantly, I think, as Professor Rock said, domestically probably this wouldn't really do much at this moment, but somehow actually globally, the U.S. leadership, U.S. positioning to Paris Agreement, to global climate change issues is very critical. It sends the signal to the global community whether global leaders are serious about international process, whether they continue to honor.
Dr. Schrag, as the rest of the world is seeking to develop their economy in a sustainable way, the Trump administration is, or at least it seems that for the moment, no longer putting consideration of climate change at the heart of the government policies. As the largest historic emitter of carbon dioxide, is it fair to let the rest of the world pay the bills for America's development?
Well, it's certainly not fair. The U.S. has a responsibility to lead on climate change, and historically has led on climate change. And I think the 2014 U.S.-China agreement was a historic step forward, where the 2 largest emitters, U.S. and China, decided together. And I think their joint leadership was the key component of what made Paris successful and ultimately led to that international agreement. Now, let me be very clear. U.S. emissions will not return to 2005 levels. I think it's misleading to suggest that that might even happen. That is absolutely not going to happen. We're already nearly 10% below 2005 levels, and I suspect it will be much more challenging to get to the Paris goal of 26% reduction by 2025, but we will still make substantial progress towards that.
What gives you the evidence to say
alone,
that?
For the first time in history, well, it's very simple. Last year alone, for the first time, wind and solar energy, solar photovoltaics, were the largest installation of any type of new electricity generation on the grid in the U.S. More than 10 gigawatts of new installation. That exceeded natural gas, and there was 0 coal. So the trends are still positive. And by the way, President Obama's Clean Power Plan hasn't actually yet been enacted because it was held up by the courts. So all of this was happening in an environment without Obama's main regulation. Now, we certainly are disappointed that this regulation may be blocked by Trump, but that's a long way to go still. But the economic forces, cheap natural gas, still 35% of the electricity in the U.S. is provided by coal, and over time, those coal plants are dirty, and they're getting shut down because natural gas is so inexpensive. So I suspect that will continue for the next decade at least, and we will see substantial reductions in emissions in the U.S. despite whatever Trump's policies are.
Well, Ms. Wu, what is your reaction to what Dr. Schrag just said, that indeed, although we are hearing this rhetoric, but what really happens on the ground is not going to be affected so much by what Trump has said or has said he will do? What is your reaction to that?
I agree with Professor Schrag's assessment, evaluation, and I do have the level of confidence as well in the U.S. that the technology is already there, the industry is already on board, particularly in the clean energy sector. So domestically, I think I agree with him. But on the other side, U.S. is the world's largest economy. The tone, the message, the behavior actually so far by President Trump's administration around the climate change issues, around the climate finance, green finance issues has been very, very negative to the global community. Meaning today, actually more than ever, we need to work together globally as one world actually to address global challenges like climate change issues. And the U.S.'s tone, attitude, or position actually is very, very critical to that landscape. At this moment, I have to say I'm very disappointed to see the tone, the steps taken so far by the President Trump administration. Hopefully somehow down the road that's going to change.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Schrag, now Mr. Trump argued that the Paris Agreement was unfair to the U.S. and that climate change had been created by and for the Chinese. Maybe again one of his campaign rhetoric which should be discarded by now, but let's really look at the facts. China is for the moment the biggest emitter, but authoritative data shows that since the Industrial Revolution, China's total carbon dioxide emissions have been less than half of that of the United States and less than half of that of the EU. So shouldn't the bigger polluters really share the bigger share of the responsibility?
You know, the reality is that what matters to climate, to the physical climate system, is the cumulative emissions over the entire fossil fuel era. And China right now, as you say correctly, has not yet put as much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as the US or the EU, but it's currently emitting so much that if you continue another few decades in front, it will surpass the cumulative emissions of the US and the EU. So pointing fingers about who has done what historically or in the future is really aside.
Well, China
really
has said that China has committed itself to peak its carbon dioxide emission by 2030, according to the Paris Agreement, and China said it will try its best to reach that target as early as possible. So China's commitment is there. This is not going to, and by the way, if you look at the number, China's total emissions is less than half of that of the United States that have continuously polluted over the past 1.5 century. So the difference is really big.
That's right. It is big, but China's catching up very, very quickly. My point is that all of this discussion is actually missing the big point, which is together, the U.S. and China need to lead the world beyond fossil fuels altogether. Ultimately, the goal has to be zero emissions. And that is going to take a long time, and it's going to take a lot of new technology and innovation. And both the U.S. and China have important roles to play. And I agree with you that ultimately the U.S. and with Trump's rhetoric is falling down on its responsibility. It has a very important responsibility. Now, there is a small silver lining, and I hope that China will see this as an opportunity to step up and show global leadership. The U.S. will be back, whatever Trump does, even if Trump decides to officially withdraw from the Paris Accord. Future presidents will rejoin this effort because this is just too important for the world, and the U.S. will show leadership. But there's an opportunity for China, perhaps, to step up, even in the absence of the U.S., especially for the global developing countries. You know, there are many countries in the developing world who are actually a little hesitant to get involved with climate because, well, under U.S. leadership. India, for example, with its post-colonial view of the world, I think is hesitant to be told what to do by a rich country like the U.S. On the other hand, I think
it wouldn't be so happy to be told what to do by China either. I'm afraid. Anyway, time is very limited.
Maybe, but
yeah. Go ahead, please. Finish making your point.
No, please.
Okay, my last question to
Ms.
Wu. A very interesting point Dr. Schrag made there about China's potential role if the U.S. really decides to leave this vacuum. Ms. Wu, what do you think China could possibly do? Can China fill the vacuum if the U.S. does step out of it?
I don't think it's a fair question, honestly. In reality, China has been leading, and China is leading, and I believe China will continue to lead its efforts. By leadership, that doesn't mean China will be able to take on all the responsibilities, global climate change responsibilities on its own shoulders, but rather by taking very substantive steps domestically and also reaching out to international community to address the climate change issues there. But I want to go back to the rhetoric. I think the rhetoric today actually is very important. We cannot put that on the side to say, hey, no, just wait for another 4 or 8 years. The U.S. will come back anyway. I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's a responsible way for the U.S. presidency actually to make that sort of rhetoric, and it's generating very negative impact for the global climate change process.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Daniel Schrag joining us from Washington, D.C., and Ms. Wu Changhua joining us here in Beijing. And here is my point. Donald Trump's executive order on the environment did not address the Paris climate change directly. It may not have much of an immediate effect either due to pending lawsuits, as our guest said. But together with the nomination of Scott Pruitt, a climate change denier, to head the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, and the slashing of the agency's budget, it is clear what Trump wants to be seen believing. Now, China will do what it has pledged to do, whether the U.S. is up to it or not. But the U.S. has a historic responsibility to fight climate change, as it has been the single biggest accumulated polluter in the world over the past 1.5 centuries. To deny that responsibility will be unacceptable for the rest of the world. You're watching The Point. We'll be back right after this. U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has wrapped up his visit to Ankara, Turkey. Tillerson, the most senior U.S. official to visit Turkey since President Donald Trump took office in January, was seeking to turn around recently rocky relations between the NATO allies. He met with President Recep Tayyip Erdogan for over 2 hours after talks with Prime Minister Binali Yildirim and Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu. The outcome of Tillerson's visit could determine the future of Turkey-U.S. relations. The United States and Turkey have a long history and an important friendship, but the love is hardly unconditional. This meeting was one in a series that will help determine the conditions of the bilateral relationship in the future. Whether it thrives or dies will have serious implications for both countries. For more insight, I'm joined by Dr. Richard Weitz from the Center for Political Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. Dr. Weitz, thank you very much for joining us today. Now, Tillerson said U.S. and Turkey must make difficult decisions about how to fight Islamic State in Syria. What tough decision do you think Tillerson was facing before he visited Ankara? And did you think that he achieved anything after the meeting or the meetings?
The main immediate difference is the United States is focusing on defeating ISIS by recapturing the city of Raqqa, which is seen by the United States the main base for Islamic State terrorism activities in Europe and elsewhere. The Turkish government would also not has no problem with that, but objects to the means that the U.S. is using, which is basically the U.S. is trying to work with really the only military force that is allied with it in the region, which is a Kurdish-dominated Kurdish Arab fighting force, the YPG. And the Turkish government believes that this group is too closely affiliated with the anti-Turkish terrorist affiliate based in Turkey and elsewhere, the PKK. And so the Turks do not want the United States to train, collaborate with, or work with this group to help it seize Raqqa. They want the U.S. to turn to work with some alternative force. But for now, military expediency is keeping the U.S. focused on that. And there's nothing that came out of the Tillerson visit that suggests that this difference has been resolved.
Mm-hmm. Is that why Turkish officials have called this meeting disappointing, or called Tillerson's visit disappointing? And what could be the reasons behind the failure to make any progress on this very important issue?
Well, I think it was evident as soon as they started meeting that Tillerson was going to have a tough time. He tried to address some Turkish concerns. He didn't make any comments about Erdogan's domestic political policies, about the controversial referendum, about Erdogan's calling European leaders fascists, and so on. He tried to be very nice, said very pleasant things about Turkey and its commitment, but immediately became clear that the Turkish officials were upset about U.S. policy towards the Syrian conflict, also about the presence in the United States of the leader of a group, the Gulen group, which the Turkish government believes was involved in the coup last year, a coup attempt. And it does not appear they made any progress on any of these issues. So that's probably why they said they were disappointed. They would have liked the U.S., for example, to say we won't work with the YPJ and we'll turn over Gulen to trial in Turkey, but that did not occur.
So it is not happening, the kind of expected change of policy under the new U.S. administration from the Turkish side. But looking at the big picture, while Turkey is edging closer with Russia and also having this very important job to do together with the United States, what kind of difficult situation are we seeing these three major countries positioned at this particular moment?
Right. The Russia-U.S.-Turkey triangle is very interesting. And both Russia and Turkey had, the governments there had very high hopes when Trump was elected. They had difficulties with Clinton and Obama. They thought that Trump would work, for example, by accepting Assad as the president of Syria, would work to suppress any groups that they considered to be terrorists, would do other things, and they've been very disappointed that we've not seen changes. We haven't seen repeal of sanctions on Russia. We haven't seen Trump turn over Gulen, as I mentioned, to trial in Turkey. And there's basically a lot of continuities between Trump's foreign policy and that of Obama, and they're both disappointed, and I think we're seeing that drive them together. Which, just as an aside for your viewers, as you know, the Chinese fear has been that Trump would deviate rather than welcoming that. They feared that, and it seems he's actually heading back towards Obama's course as well there, and that I think we'll see next week when the President Xi comes here.
Mm-hmm. What do you look at the important issues that have to be addressed constructively between Turkey and the United States if they are going to come closer towards each other in the future? What would have to happen in your eyes?
Well, I think we're in a short-term crisis now because of the need to deal with the crisis, the conflict in Syria, and the question of the referendum that's about to occur in Turkey, and that's maybe making the Turkish officials take this strong stance on some issues. So I think that after the referendum occurs, the Turkish government may no longer be so critical of Western policies. I think that after Raqqa is captured, we may see the U.S. distance itself from the Kurds, provide more reassurance about Turkey about security. So I think we've got a difficulty in the next 2 weeks, but after that it's possible to see some of the sources of tension between the two countries fade.
Mm-hmm. Let's look at the potential consequence, the referendum that Erdogan is eyeing to win on the relationship Turkey has with the United States. What kind of changes it could possibly bring to bilateral ties, you think?
Right. The United States, as I said, under Trump, has not been as critical as many others have been. There are many in Europe and in the Congress here and elsewhere who have criticized Erdogan for trying to basically become an authoritarian leader, giving himself too much power, and not providing adequate recognition of the role of opposition groups, arresting journalists, and so on. The Trump administration has declined to make that criticism. And I think that the referendum outcome, if it goes well for Erdogan, that could remove a possible source of tension in the near term. If it fails, he may start looking for scapegoats, and then I worry that he'll blame the U.S. as well as Europe and so on. So it's actually an important issue.
Thank you very much, Dr. Richard Weitz, joining from Washington, D.C. And don't go away. My last point is coming up right after this. Turkey, considered a key piece of the war on terror strategy, seems intent on walking a line between Moscow and Washington, but to what end it is not clear. Russo-Turkish trade is slowly resuming, but an ailing Russian economy cannot give Turkey the investment it needs to stabilize its economy. Is this about Erdogan's desire to consolidate power by bringing Fethullah Gulen back to Turkey, or has Turkey lost faith in the direction and resolve of US policies in the region? We'll have to wait and see. That's all for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, here on CGTN. Follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the CGTN Live application to watch our show on your mobile devices. And for previous shows, go to the CGTN channel of YouTube, click on the playlist and look for The Point with Liu Xin. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on Monday at the same time.